In the blistering summer heat of Texas, the story begins with a heart-wrenching scene. A young girl, alone and struggling to survive, is thrust into the lives of strangers who will forever alter her destiny. Secrets from the past and tensions within a wealthy household threaten to unravel as one act of kindness brings turmoil. What lies ahead for this resilient child? Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe for the full story. The sun baked the streets of Austin, and the asphalt shimmered like a mirage. 11-year-old Lucy Bennett stood at the corner of a bustling intersection, her hollow eyes scanning the crowd. She clutched a battered tin cup, the faint jingle of coins her only solace. Lucy was a regular in the shadows of Austin's chaos, surviving on scraps and odd jobs. Her clothes hung loosely on her tiny frame, and her curly brown hair was matted with dust. On this particular day, she'd made the mistake of wandering too close to a group of teenagers lounging near the riverbank. "Hey, rat," one of them jeered. "Think you're too good to say hello?" Lucy turned to leave, but they surrounded her. Taunts turned to shoves, and before she knew it, she was sprawled in the dirt, clutching her stomach where a sneaker had landed. "Leave me alone," she cried, her voice barely audible over their laughter. But the world had other plans. Disoriented, Lucy stumbled away and found herself at the edge of a serene, gated community. Beyond the imposing iron fence, the lake sparkled like a jewel, a stark contrast to her harsh reality. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the manicured grass, her body surrendering to exhaustion and pain. The next morning, Richard Walden rose early, his routine as precise as the ticking of the grandfather clock in his study. A self-made man and financial magnate, Richard was accustomed to control. His mornings were for quiet reflection in his expansive garden, a sanctuary of calm amid his high-stakes world. But this morning was different. As he stepped onto the patio, a movement in the bushes caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, but as he approached, he saw the small, crumpled figure of a girl. She was covered in dirt, her face marred by scratches, and her lips dry and cracked. "Dear God," Richard murmured, kneeling beside her. Lucy stirred, her eyes fluttering open briefly. "Please," she whispered before losing consciousness. Richard carried Lucy into his sprawling mansion, his arms cradling her limp body. Margaret, his wife, appeared at the top of the staircase, her silk robe shimmering in the morning light. Her perfectly styled hair framed a face that was equal parts beauty and coldness. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "She's a child, Margaret," Richard replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I found her on our property. She's hurt and needs help." Margaret descended the stairs, her lips pursed in disapproval. "We're not a charity, Richard. Call the authorities." "Not yet," he said firmly. "She's staying until we figure out who she is and where she belongs." Margaret huffed but said no more. Lucy was cleaned up and placed in the guest room, her small frame swallowed by the large bed. Evelyn, the long-serving housekeeper, brought a tray of soup and water, her kind eyes softening as she looked at the sleeping girl. "She's just a child," Evelyn murmured. "Yes," Richard agreed. "But what kind of life has she lived to end up like this?" When Lucy awoke hours later, the room was dark, save for the glow of a bedside lamp. She blinked, disoriented by the luxury around her. The soft bedding, the plush carpet, the faint scent of lavender, it was unlike anything she had ever known. The door creaked open, and Evelyn entered, carrying fresh clothes. "Hello, sweetheart," she said warmly. "Don't be afraid. You're safe here." Lucy sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Where am I?" "You're in Mr. Walden's home," Evelyn replied. "He found you outside. You'll rest here for now." "Why?" Lucy's voice trembled. "Why would he help me?" "Because he has a good heart," Evelyn said, though the words felt like a stretch. Over dinner that evening, Margaret voiced her displeasure. "Richard, this is ridiculous," she said, her fork clinking against her plate. "We can't have a stray child disrupting our lives." Richard's jaw tightened. "She's not a stray, Margaret. She's a person. And until we know more about her, she stays. Lucy, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, felt a lump form in her throat. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that someone cared. But hope was fleeting. The next morning, Margaret cornered Lucy in the kitchen. "Listen carefully," Margaret said, her tone icy. "I don't care what sob story brought you here. You will not ruin my home. Stay out of sight and out of trouble, or I'll make sure you regret it." Lucy's heart pounded. She nodded mutely, retreating to her room with tears stinging her eyes. As the days passed, Lucy noticed a strange tension in the house. Richard was kind but distant, consumed by his work. Margaret's disdain was evident in every glare and sharp word. Evelyn was her only ally, sneaking her extra food and offering kind words when no one was looking. One evening, while exploring the library, Lucy stumbled upon a photo album tucked behind a row of books. Inside, she found a picture of a woman with familiar features, curly brown hair and deep, soulful eyes. "Who are you?" Lucy whispered, her fingers tracing the image. Footsteps echoed behind her, and she quickly hid the album. Margaret entered the room, her gaze suspicious. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded. "Nothing," Lucy lied, clutching the album behind her back. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Stay away from things that don't concern you." Lucy nodded, but her mind raced with questions. Who was the woman in the photograph? And why did she feel an unshakable connection to her? As the night fell, Lucy sat by the window of her room, staring at the moonlit garden. For the first time in her short life, she wasn't just fighting to survive, she was fighting for answers. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of the guest room, waking Lucy from a restless sleep. She lay still for a moment, her body aching from the days of torment that had brought her to this strange house. The softness of the bed felt alien against her bruised frame, and the quiet luxury of the room only heightened her unease. This was not her world. Lucy heard voices drifting up from downstairs, the tone sharp and unmistakably about her. Pulling herself out of bed, she crept to the door and cracked it open just enough to hear Margaret's icy words. "She doesn't belong here, Richard." "You're putting us in an impossible position," Margaret snapped. "She's a child in need," Richard replied, his voice low but firm. "What kind of people would we be if we turned her away?" "The kind who mind their own business," Margaret countered. "This girl will bring trouble, mark my words." Downstairs, Richard sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as he leaned against the marble countertop. He wasn't blind to Margaret's objections, she'd always been resistant to anything that disrupted her carefully curated world. But the sight of Lucy, broken and alone in their garden, haunted him. Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And what will people say when they find out you've taken in some street child? Think of your reputation." Richard straightened, his eyes narrowing. "My reputation is the least of my concerns, Margaret. If you can't see that she needs help, then perhaps you've lost more of your humanity than I thought." The words stung Margaret, but she quickly masked her reaction with a cold smirk. "You always were a bleeding heart, Richard. Don't say I didn't warn you when this goes wrong." Upstairs, Lucy pulled away from the door, her stomach twisting. She wasn't surprised by Margaret's hostility, she'd seen it in the woman's eyes from the moment they met. What surprised her was Richard's insistence on keeping her there. No one had ever stood up for her before, and the unfamiliar feeling of being defended left her both grateful and apprehensive. Still, gratitude couldn't erase the reality that she was unwelcome in this house. With a sigh, she shuffled over to the window and looked out at the garden below. It was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen. The flowers, perfectly trimmed hedges, and sparkling lake seemed like they belonged to a different world, one she could never truly be part of. Later that morning, Evelyn knocked softly on Lucy's door before entering with a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, dear," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the bed. Lucy sat up, her wary eyes meeting Evelyn's kind gaze. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Evelyn smiled. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. You just eat up and get your strength back." As Lucy picked at the food, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, her tone turning serious. "Listen, I know Mrs. Walden can be difficult. But don't let her words get to you. Mr. Walden has a good heart. He won't let anything happen to you." Lucy nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. People had let things happen to her before, things far worse than harsh words. By the afternoon, Richard called Lucy to his study. She entered hesitantly, her eyes scanning the walls lined with books and the massive oak desk that dominated the room. Richard sat behind it, his expression a mixture of kindness and curiosity. "Come in, Lucy," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She perched on the edge of the chair, her small hands gripping the armrests tightly. "Do you remember anything about your family?" Richard asked gently. "Where you came from?" Lucy shook her head. "I don't know. It's been a long time since I had a family." Richard leaned back, his brow furrowed. "And the people you lived with before? The ones who left you in the streets?" "They weren't my family," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just people who didn't want me." Richard's heart sank. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it from the girl herself made it all the more real. "Well, you have a place here now," he said firmly. "At least until we figure out what to do next." Lucy nodded, though her expression remained guarded. She'd learned long ago not to trust words too easily. As the days turned into weeks, Lucy's presence in the Walden household began to stir the delicate balance of their lives. Margaret's irritation grew with each passing day, her smiles becoming tighter and her words sharper. Evelyn continued to watch over Lucy, offering small gestures of kindness whenever she could. But not everyone in the house shared Evelyn's compassion. One afternoon, Margaret's teenage son, Thomas, returned from boarding school for a short break. With his sharp features and arrogant demeanor, Thomas was every bit his mother's son. When he first saw Lucy, sitting quietly in the corner of the living room with a book Evelyn had given her, his eyes narrowed. "Who's the stray?" he asked loudly, smirking. Lucy looked up, startled. Margaret, who was arranging flowers nearby, didn't bother to correct him. "She's no one you need to worry about," Margaret said dismissively. "Just a temporary guest." Thomas chuckled. "Temporary, huh? Guess that means you won't be staying long, will you?" he said to Lucy, his tone mocking. Lucy didn't respond, but her cheeks flushed with humiliation. That evening, during dinner, Margaret saw an opportunity to humiliate Lucy further. She instructed her to serve the table, despite Evelyn's protests that it wasn't appropriate. "Let her earn her keep," Margaret said with a cold smile. Lucy moved around the table cautiously, balancing a tray of drinks with trembling hands. When she accidentally spilled water on Thomas's arm, he let out an exaggerated gasp. "Are you serious?" he exclaimed, glaring at her. "You can't even do this right?" Lucy's face burned with shame as Margaret's sharp laughter filled the room. Richard, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. "That's enough, Thomas," he said firmly. "Lucy is our guest, not a servant." Margaret shot him a warning look, but Richard ignored her. Late that night, Lucy sat alone in her room, her head buried in her knees. The humiliation of the evening still lingered, but more than that, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. She thought of the photo she'd found in the library, the woman with the kind eyes who looked so much like her. Who was she? And why did Margaret seem so intent on keeping Lucy in her place? A faint sound outside her window broke her thoughts. Peering out into the darkness, she saw a shadowy figure moving near the edge of the garden. For a moment, fear gripped her. Who, or what, was watching her? Lucy sat frozen by the window, her heart pounding as she watched the shadowy figure move through the garden. The dim moonlight offered just enough illumination for her to make out the vague outline of a person, too far away to identify, but close enough to send chills down her spine. Who was it? Was it someone from her past? Or perhaps Margaret had sent someone to frighten her, to remind her that she didn't belong here? She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain. Moments later, the figure disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the hedge-lined pathways. Lucy waited, her pulse racing, but the figure did not return. The next morning, Lucy awoke early, the events of the previous night still vivid in her mind. She hesitated before heading downstairs for breakfast, uncertain whether she should mention what she had seen. Would anyone even believe her? In the dining room, Margaret and Thomas were already seated, their conversation peppered with disdainful laughter. Richard, as usual, had left early for the office, and Evelyn moved silently around the room, setting plates and pouring coffee. As Lucy entered, Margaret barely glanced at her. "Good, you're awake," Margaret said curtly. "You can clear the garden later. The leaves are piling up." Lucy looked down, nodding meekly. She had learned not to argue with Margaret. Later that morning, while raking the garden, Lucy's thoughts returned to the mysterious figure. The neatly trimmed hedges and manicured lawns now seemed more menacing than picturesque, as if they concealed hidden secrets. "Having fun, Stray?" Lucy turned to see Thomas leaning against the veranda railing, a smirk plastered across his face. "You look like you belong out here, doing the dirty work," he sneered. "Guess that's all you're good for." Lucy ignored him, focusing on the pile of leaves she was gathering. But Thomas wasn't finished. "Think you'll stay here forever?" he taunted. "You're just another charity case. My mother will see to it that you're gone soon." Her hands tightened around the rake, but she refused to look at him. That afternoon, while wandering through the library in search of solace, Lucy stumbled upon the photo album she had hidden days earlier. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The photo of the woman who resembled her mother stared back at her, the kind eyes seeming to hold a secret Lucy couldn't yet grasp. "Who are you?" she whispered again. She tucked the album under her arm and decided to confront Evelyn. If anyone in the house would tell her the truth, it would be the kind-hearted housekeeper. Evelyn was in the kitchen, kneading dough for that evening's dinner. When Lucy approached, clutching the album, Evelyn looked up with a soft smile. "Need something, dear?" Lucy hesitated before setting the album on the counter and opening it to the photograph. "Do you know her?" Lucy asked, her voice barely audible. Evelyn's smile faltered, and a shadow passed over her face. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned closer, studying the picture. "That's Claire," Evelyn said after a long pause. "She used to work here, a long time ago." Lucy's heart leapt. What happened to her? Evelyn glanced toward the kitchen door, as if ensuring they were alone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She left suddenly," Evelyn said, choosing her words carefully. "There were circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Lucy pressed. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and caution. "It's not my place to say. But Claire was a good woman, and she deserved better." That evening, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn knew more than she was letting on. Determined to find answers, she waited until the house was quiet before sneaking back into the library. She searched the shelves methodically, hoping to find more clues about Claire. Her efforts were rewarded when she discovered a locked drawer in Richard's desk. A brass key lay nearby, and though guilt tugged at her, she couldn't resist. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, their edges yellowed with age. One letter, in particular, caught her eye. It was addressed to Richard but written in a shaky, hurried hand. "Please, Mr. Walden, I need your help. My daughter's life depends on it." The signature at the bottom made Lucy's breath catch, Claire Bennett. Before she could read further, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Panic surged through her. She shoved the letter back into the drawer, locked it, and returned the key just as the library door creaked open. Margaret stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice cold. I was just looking at the books," Lucy stammered, her face burning. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. "Stay out of this room unless you're invited. Do you understand me?" Lucy nodded quickly and slipped past Margaret, her heart pounding. She could still feel the weight of Claire's words, the urgency of her plea. The following day, Lucy's tension only grew. She avoided Margaret and Thomas as much as possible, spending most of her time outdoors. But even the bright sun couldn't chase away the questions swirling in her mind. By late afternoon, she found herself near the edge of the property, where the hedges gave way to a small wooded area. It was then that she saw it again, the shadowy figure from the previous night. This time, she didn't hesitate. "Wait!" Lucy called, running toward the figure. The person froze for a moment, then turned and began walking briskly away. Lucy chased them, her bare feet pounding against the soft earth. "Who are you?" she shouted. "Why are you watching me?" The figure stopped abruptly and turned. In the fading light, Lucy caught a glimpse of a pale, weathered face framed by unkempt gray hair. The woman's eyes were wild, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said in a raspy voice. "It's not safe." Before Lucy could respond, the woman disappeared into the trees, leaving Lucy breathless and trembling. That night, as Lucy lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. Who was the woman in the woods? And why had she warned Lucy to leave? For the first time, Lucy began to wonder if she had stumbled into something far bigger and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The next morning dawned overcast, the gray sky casting a somber mood over the Walden estate. Lucy awoke feeling restless, the strange encounter from the night before replaying in her mind. The woman's warning, so cryptic yet urgent, echoed in her thoughts. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." Lucy couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. What wasn't safe? The house? The people in it? Or something else entirely? Downstairs, breakfast was as tense as ever. Margaret sipped her coffee, her nails tapping against the porcelain cup as she read the morning paper. Thomas lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone, while Evelyn bustled about, her usual warmth muted. Richard's absence was palpable. He had left early for a business meeting, leaving Lucy alone with Margaret and Thomas. As Lucy entered the dining room, Margaret barely acknowledged her, gesturing vaguely toward a plate of toast and eggs on the counter. "You can eat in the kitchen," Margaret said coldly. "The dining table is for family." Lucy hesitated, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. She turned to leave, but Evelyn intercepted her. "Nonsense, Mrs. Walden," Evelyn said firmly, setting a place for Lucy at the table. "She'll eat here, just like everyone else." Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation, but she said nothing, opting instead to return to her newspaper. As the day wore on, Lucy couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the house made her jump. The memory of the woman in the woods gnawed at her, and she longed for answers. By mid-afternoon, she found herself back in the library, drawn to the locked drawer where she had discovered Claire Bennett's letter. She knew the risk, but the desire to know more about her mother overpowered her fear. With trembling hands, she retrieved the brass key and unlocked the drawer once again. This time, she was more thorough, sifting through the stack of letters and documents. Many were mundane, receipts, contracts, correspondence from business partners, but tucked beneath the pile, she found a small leather-bound journal. The initials CB were embossed on the cover. Lucy's breath caught. She opened the journal to the first page, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "For my daughter, Lucy, so she will one day know the truth." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned the pages, reading snippets of her mother's life. Entries described her time working for the Walden family, the struggles she faced, and her growing fear of Margaret's cruelty. But one entry stopped Lucy cold. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine. Margaret knows about Lucy, and I don't trust her. I'm leaving tomorrow, no matter what it takes." Lucy's hands trembled as she clutched the journal. Her mother had planned to escape, planned to take her away from whatever darkness had consumed this house. But something had gone horribly wrong. "Lucy!" The voice startled her, and she spun around, clutching the journal to her chest. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and fear. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed to know," Lucy stammered. "About my mother. About Claire." Evelyn closed the door behind her and approached Lucy slowly. "You shouldn't be in here. If Mrs. Walden finds you—" "She already hates me," Lucy said bitterly. "What else can she do?" Evelyn sighed, sitting beside Lucy. Her gaze fell on the journal in Lucy's hands. "So, you know about Claire. She was my mother, wasn't she?" Lucy asked, her voice breaking. Evelyn nodded. "Yes. She was a good woman, Lucy. Kind and hardworking. But she crossed Margaret, and that was her undoing." "What happened to her?" Lucy asked, desperation lacing her words. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes filling with sorrow. "It's not my story to tell. But I'll say this, Margaret will do whatever it takes to protect herself. Be careful, Lucy." That evening, Lucy wandered the garden, her thoughts swirling. She clutched her mother's journal tightly, unwilling to let it out of her sight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in shadows, she heard a familiar voice. Well, if it isn't the stray," Thomas said, stepping out from behind a tree. Lucy tensed, her grip on the journal tightening. "What do you want?" Thomas smirked, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Just curious. You've been sneaking around a lot lately. Find anything interesting?" "It's none of your business," Lucy snapped, turning to leave. But Thomas blocked her path, his smirk turning cruel. "Careful, Lucy. Secrets don't stay hidden for long in this house. And if you're not careful, you might end up just like your mother." Lucy froze, her heart pounding. "What do you know about my mother?" Thomas leaned in closer, his voice a low whisper. "Enough to know you're wasting your time. She's gone, Lucy. And no amount of digging will change that." Before Lucy could respond, Thomas walked away, leaving her trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. That night, Lucy lay awake, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the wind. She couldn't shake Thomas's words, or the warning from the woman in the woods. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with fragmented images of her mother, the shadowy figure, and Margaret's cold, unyielding glare. As dawn broke, Lucy resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She couldn't keep living in fear, haunted by unanswered questions. But as she rose from bed and peered out the window, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the garden, beneath the faint morning light, lay a shattered vase, one of Margaret's prized possessions. And beside it, scrawled in the dirt, were two words, "Stay silent." Lucy stared at the chilling message scrawled in the dirt, "Stay silent." The morning sun hadn't yet burned off the mist clinging to the garden, and the eerie scene before her made her feel as though the air had grown colder. Her hands trembled as she stepped away from the window. Who had written it? Was it Margaret? Thomas? Or perhaps the shadowy figures she'd seen in the woods? She clutched her mother's journal tightly to her chest, her heart pounding with fear and anger. Lucy knew one thing: someone wanted to keep her from discovering the truth. Downstairs, the tension in the Walden household was palpable. Margaret's shrill voice echoed through the halls as she berated Evelyn. "I want this mess cleaned up immediately. How could something like this happen?" Margaret snapped, gesturing toward the shattered vase now lying in pieces on the dining room table. Evelyn, her face composed, quietly swept the shards into a dustpan. "It was likely the wind, ma'am. I'll take care of it." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The wind? Don't insult my intelligence, Evelyn. Someone is responsible for this, and I intend to find out who." Lucy entered the room cautiously, trying to appear as though she hadn't overheard the argument. Margaret's gaze immediately locked onto her, and Lucy felt a shiver run down her spine. "Ah, there you are," Margaret said, her tone dripping with disdain. Do you have anything to confess, Lucy? Lucy blinked, confused. What? Margaret stepped closer, her expression cold and calculating. The vase. Did you do this? Lucy shook her head vehemently. No! I didn't. Liar, Margaret hissed. You've been sneaking around this house, poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Don't think I haven't noticed. Leave her alone, Mrs. Walden, Evelyn interjected, her voice steady but firm. There's no evidence that Lucy had anything to do with it. Margaret glared at Evelyn but didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to Lucy, her lip curling in disdain. Mark my words, girl. One wrong move, and you'll regret ever stepping foot in this house. Lucy retreated to her room, tears stinging her eyes. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her mother's journal. Margaret's words echoed in her mind, but they only strengthened her resolve. She opened the journal to the next entry, eager for any clue that might shed light on her mother's past. I'm running out of time. Margaret suspects something, and I know she won't stop until she gets what she wants. I have to protect Lucy, no matter what. Lucy's stomach churned. The more she read, the clearer it became that Margaret wasn't just cruel, she was dangerous. Later that afternoon, Lucy found herself in the garden, raking leaves as Margaret had instructed. Her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. She thought about the message in the dirt, the shattered vase, and her mother's desperate words. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Daydreaming again? Lucy turned to see Thomas leaning against a tree, a smirk on his face. Leave me alone, she muttered, continuing her work. Touchy, aren't we? Thomas said, strolling closer. You know, I've been thinking. Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from. You're just making things worse for yourself here. Lucy ignored him, her grip tightening on the rake. Or maybe you like the drama, Thomas continued, his tone mocking. I mean, it's not like anyone really wants you here. My mother certainly doesn't. Shut up, Lucy snapped, turning to face him. Thomas's smirk widened. Hit a nerve, did I? Don't worry, stray. You'll be gone soon enough. Before Lucy could respond, Thomas turned and walked away, leaving her seething with frustration. That night, Lucy sat in bed, the journal open on her lap. She traced her fingers over the words, imagining her mother's voice. But her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Lucy? It was Evelyn. She entered the room quietly, carrying a tray with a mug of warm milk. I thought you might need this, Evelyn said, setting the tray on the nightstand. Thank you, Lucy said softly. Evelyn sat beside her, her gaze falling on the open journal. You've been reading it, haven't you? Lucy nodded. I need to know what happened to her. Evelyn sighed, her expression pained. Your mother loved you more than anything, Lucy. She would have done anything to keep you safe. Then why did she leave? Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't she take me with her? She didn't leave by choice, Evelyn said gently. Something happened, something I don't fully understand. But I know this, Margaret had a hand in it. She always does. Lucy's heart sank. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was one of betrayal and heartbreak. The next day, Margaret called Lucy to the sitting room. The coldness in her tone made Lucy's stomach twist. I have a task for you, Margaret said, gesturing to a set of silverware on the table. Polish these until they shine. And don't stop until they're perfect. Lucy nodded silently, knowing better than to argue. As she worked, Margaret hovered nearby, her sharp gaze making Lucy's skin crawl. You know, it's quite pathetic, Margaret said after a while. All this sneaking around, pretending you're something you're not. Do you think you're special? You're nothing but a nuisance. Lucy kept her head down, her hands trembling as she polished the silverware. I suggest you start behaving, Margaret continued, her voice low and menacing. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you end up exactly like your mother." Lucy froze, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll find out soon enough." That evening, as Lucy sat in her room, the weight of Margaret's words pressed heavily on her chest. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to find the truth about her mother, even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. Gathering her courage, she opened the journal to the final pages, desperate for answers. What she found left her breathless. "If you're reading this, Lucy, it means I couldn't protect you. But you must be brave. The truth is in the house. You just have to find it." The truth was here, in the Walden estate. But finding it could cost Lucy everything. "Vok!" The words from her mother's journal echoed in Lucy's mind. The truth is in the house. You just have to find it. It wasn't a comforting message, it felt more like a challenge, or worse, a warning. Lucy stared at the page, her heart racing. What truth? And why had her mother been so afraid? Whatever it was, Margaret had clearly been at the center of it. That much was obvious. But there was more to uncover, and Lucy was determined to find it, even if it meant facing the wrath of the Waldens. The following morning, the estate seemed eerily quiet. Richard had left early again, and Thomas had gone into town with friends. Margaret was still upstairs, likely planning her next cruel move. Evelyn, always watchful, whispered to Lucy in the kitchen. "Be careful today," Evelyn said, her voice low. "She's been on edge since last night." Lucy nodded. She had no intention of crossing Margaret today, not directly, at least. Her focus was on the journal's cryptic message. Lucy spent hours wandering the house, trying to decipher her mother's warning. She revisited the library, combing through shelves of books and stacks of old papers. She even ventured into the attic, where dust and cobwebs clung to forgotten furniture and boxes of belongings. It was in the attic that she stumbled upon something unexpected, a small, locked chest tucked beneath a pile of old linens. The chest was plain, made of dark wood with tarnished brass hinges. Lucy tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She carried the chest downstairs, her mind racing with possibilities. Who had hidden it? And what was inside? In the kitchen, Evelyn raised an eyebrow at the chest. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," Lucy replied. "Do you know what's inside?" Evelyn shook her head. "I'd never seen it before. But if it was hidden up there, it's probably something Margaret doesn't want anyone to find." Lucy's stomach tightened. If that were true, then she was in even greater danger. That afternoon, Lucy sat in her room, staring at the locked chest. She had tried every key she could find in the house, but none of them fit. Frustrated, she turned to the journal, hoping for a clue. In one entry, her mother described a small key she kept hidden in her favorite spot, a quiet place she called her sanctuary. Lucy frowned, trying to imagine where that might be. Then it hit her, the garden. Her mother had worked on the estate as a housekeeper, and Evelyn had once mentioned that Claire loved tending to the garden. Lucy hurried outside, her heart pounding. The garden was sprawling, with winding pathways and hidden nooks. Lucy searched frantically, overturning rocks and digging through flower beds. At last, near the edge of the garden, she found a small, rusted box buried beneath a rose bush. Inside was a tiny brass key. Her hands shook as she ran back to her room and inserted the key into the lock of the chest. With a satisfying click, the lid opened. Inside, she found a bundle of letters, photographs, and a thick envelope sealed with wax. The letters were from her mother, addressed to someone named R. Lucy's chest tightened as she realized the letters were meant for Richard. The photographs were of her mother, smiling, carefree, and holding a baby. Lucy recognized herself instantly. But it was the envelope that made her pause. Breaking the seal, she unfolded a single sheet of paper. The contents of the letter sent shivers down her spine. Richard. Margaret knows about Lucy. She knows the truth, and she will do anything to keep it buried. You need to protect her. Please, for my sake. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll keep Lucy safe. Claire. Lucy's hands trembled as she clutched the letter. Her mother had written to Richard, begging for his help. But why? What truth was Margaret so desperate to hide? Before she could process the revelation, the door to her room burst open. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. What do you think you're doing? Margaret demanded, her voice cold and sharp. Lucy scrambled to hide the chest, but Margaret was too fast. She snatched it from the bed, her eyes narrowing as she saw the open contents. How dare you? Margaret hissed, her voice low and dangerous. These are my mother's. Lucy shouted, her fear momentarily eclipsed by anger. You've been hiding them from me. Margaret's lips curled into a cruel smile. Your mother had no right to leave these here. And you have no right to dig into things that don't concern you. She asked Richard to protect me, Lucy said, her voice trembling. She knew you were dangerous. Margaret's expression darkened. You have no idea what you're talking about, little girl. Your mother was a liar and a thief. And now you're following in her footsteps. That's not true. Lucy cried. Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If you think Richard will believe your little sob story, you're mistaken. He doesn't care about you. You're nothing to him, nothing but a mistake. Lucy's chest tightened as tears blurred her vision. You're lying. Margaret laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Believe what you want. But if you don't stop meddling, I'll make sure you regret it. She turned on her heel, the chest tucked under her arm, and stormed out of the room. Lucy sat frozen, her mother's letter still clutched in her hand. Margaret's words had shaken her, but they had also ignited a spark of defiance. Her mother had trusted Richard, had believed he would protect her. Lucy had to find a way to get through to him, to show him the truth before it was too late. But as night fell over the estate, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's threats were far from empty. The truth might have been hidden in the house, but uncovering it had come at a cost. And now, Margaret would stop at nothing to ensure it stayed buried. The weight of her mother's letter pressed heavily on Lucy's chest as she lay awake that night. Margaret's threats still rang in her ears, her icy words cutting deeper than any wound. But Lucy couldn't let fear stop her. Her mother had fought to protect her, even in the face of Margaret's cruelty. Now, it was Lucy's turn to fight back. She clutched the letter tightly, knowing it was her lifeline, the proof she needed to confront Richard. If she could get him to read it, he would see the truth. But how could she do that with Margaret watching her every move? The next morning, Lucy moved cautiously around the house. Margaret was in one of her usual moods, her sharp voice carrying through the halls as she barked orders at Evelyn and berated Thomas for his laziness. Honestly, Thomas, Margaret snapped over breakfast. Do something useful for once. Your father will be home tonight, and I won't have this house looking like a pigsty. Thomas rolled his eyes, lounging in his chair as if he hadn't a care in the world. Why don't you make the straight clean-up? Isn't that why she's here? Lucy, standing in the doorway, felt a flare of anger but said nothing. Margaret's eyes flicked to her, a sly smile curving her lips. You're right, Thomas, Margaret said sweetly. Lucy, why don't you clean the study? I want it spotless before Richard gets back. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. The study was where Richard kept his most important documents. Margaret had never allowed her near it before. Yes, ma'am, Lucy said quietly, her mind racing. Lucy moved carefully as she cleaned the study, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might help her. She dusted the bookshelves, straightened the papers on Richard's desk, and wiped down the polished wood surfaces. Then she noticed it, a locked drawer in the corner of the desk. The same drawer where she had found her mother's journal. Her heart quickened. Margaret had taken the chest, but maybe there was something else in there, something she hadn't yet discovered. Lucy knelt by the drawer, her fingers tracing the edges of the lock. She still had the brass key she'd found in the garden. Would it work again? With a deep breath, she inserted the key. Click. The drawer slid open, revealing a small stack of letters and documents. Lucy rifled through them quickly, her hands trembling. Most of it was business correspondence, but one envelope stood out. It was addressed to Richard, with no return address. Inside, she found a single page, written in the same handwriting as her mother's journal. Richard. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. Margaret is growing more suspicious by the day, and I fear for Lucy's safety. She must never find out the truth about her. Claire. Lucy's hands shook as she read the letter. The truth about her? What truth? Before she could think further, the door to the study creaked open. Lucy froze, clutching the letter. Margaret stepped inside, her eyes narrowing as she saw Lucy kneeling by the desk. What do you think you're doing? Margaret demanded, her voice low and dangerous. I was cleaning, Lucy stammered, quickly sliding the letter into her pocket. Margaret's gaze swept the room, her sharp eyes narrowing. Get out. Now. Lucy didn't wait for a second command. She bolted from the room, her heart pounding. That evening, Richard returned from his trip, his presence bringing a brief sense of calm to the tense household. At dinner, Lucy kept her head down, her mind racing as she tried to find a way to show him the letter. Margaret, of course, was on her best behavior, her voice syrupy sweet as she spoke to Richard about mundane household matters. Thomas played along, feigning interest in his father's business ventures. But Lucy noticed something in Richard's demeanor, a weariness, as if he were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. After dinner, Lucy waited until the house was quiet. She crept down the hallway to Richard's study, the letter still tucked safely in her pocket. The door was ajar, and she peeked inside. Richard sat at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked up as Lucy knocked softly on the doorframe. Lucy, he said, his voice tired but kind. What are you doing up? I need to show you something, she said, stepping into the room. Richard frowned but motioned for her to continue. Lucy pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. This is from my mother, she said. You need to read it. Richard unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the page. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to sorrow. Claire, he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. Lucy hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. What happened to her? Why was she so afraid of Margaret? Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She worked for us for years, and she loved you more than anything. But Margaret, she saw Claire as a threat. And when Claire tried to leave. He trailed off, his hands gripping the letter tightly. What happened? Lucy pressed. Richard's eyes met hers, filled with regret. Margaret made sure she couldn't leave. She accused Claire of stealing, of lying, of things she never did. And when Claire tried to fight back, Margaret. Lucy's chest tightened. Did Margaret hurt her? I don't know, Richard admitted. But I know she made Claire's life unbearable. And I didn't do enough to stop it. Before Richard could say more, the door to the study slammed open. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face twisted with rage. What is going on here? She demanded. Richard rose from his chair, holding the letter. We're talking about Claire. And about Lucy. You've kept too many secrets, Margaret. It's time to tell the truth. Margaret's eyes darted between them, her composure faltering for the first time. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. You have no idea what you're talking about, she spat. Claire was nothing but a liar and a thief. She deserved everything she got. Lucy stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. She was my mother. And she was trying to protect me from you. Margaret's face darkened. You little brat. That's enough. Richard's voice thundered through the room, silencing Margaret. "If you think I'll let you continue this charade, you're sorely mistaken." The tension in the room was suffocating. Lucy clung to the letter, her heart pounding. For the first time, it felt like the truth was within reach. But Margaret wasn't finished. With a venomous glare, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. "She won't give up," Richard warned, his voice heavy. "We need to be careful." Lucy nodded, but inside, she knew the confrontation had only just begun. The house felt like a ticking time bomb, each moment charged with tension. Margaret's wrath after the confrontation in the study had reverberated through the Walden estate. She barely spoke to Richard, and her icy glances at Lucy were laced with malice. Lucy knew that Margaret was planning something, and it terrified her. But Richard's support gave her hope. For the first time, someone believed her. Someone cared. But the question remained, what was Margaret hiding? The next morning, Lucy found Evelyn in the kitchen, her usually calm demeanor replaced with unease. "You stirred up a hornet's nest last night, child," Evelyn said, her voice low as she handed Lucy a slice of toast. "Margaret won't let this go." "I know," Lucy replied. "But Richard is on my side now. He'll help me." Evelyn hesitated. "Just be careful. Margaret has a way of twisting things to her advantage." Lucy nodded, but her resolve didn't waver. She couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close. Margaret spent most of the day sequestered in her bedroom, but when she emerged in the afternoon, she was all smiles. The sudden shift in her demeanor sent a chill down Lucy's spine. At dinner, Margaret announced her plans with a casual air that barely concealed her true intent. "Richard, I've been thinking," Margaret began, her tone syrupy sweet. "This situation with Lucy, it's not sustainable. We can't keep her here forever. It's not fair to anyone." Richard's expression darkened. "What are you suggesting, Margaret?" "I've made some calls," Margaret said, her smile widening. "There's a lovely institution nearby that specializes in helping children like her." Lucy's stomach dropped. "You want to send me away?" "It's for your own good, dear," Margaret said, feigning concern. "You'll have everything you need there, a bed, meals, proper care. Isn't that what you want?" "No," Lucy said firmly, her voice trembling with anger. "I want to stay here." "Enough, Margaret," Richard interjected, his tone sharp. "Lucy isn't going anywhere. She's staying here, with us." Margaret's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "We'll see," she said lightly, though her eyes glinted with cold determination. That night, Lucy lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that Margaret's plans went far deeper than she had let on. The idea of being sent away terrified her, not because of the institution itself, but because it would mean leaving her mother's truth buried forever. Around midnight, a sound outside her window jolted her from her thoughts. She crept to the window and peered out, her breath catching when she saw a familiar figure. The woman from the woods stood at the edge of the garden, her gray hair wild in the moonlight. Lucy didn't hesitate. She grabbed her jacket and slipped out of her room, careful not to make a sound. The night air was cool against her skin as she approached the woman, who stood motionless by the hedges. "You're here again," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "Why? Who are you?" The woman turned slowly, her face lined with age and sorrow. "I told you before, child. It's not safe here. You need to leave." "I can't," Lucy said. "Not until I know the truth. You know something about my mother, don't you?" The woman's expression darkened. "Your mother was brave, but she trusted the wrong people. Margaret, she destroyed her." Lucy's heart ached at the words, but she pressed on. "What happened to her? Please, I need to know." The woman hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Claire tried to leave, but Margaret found out. She accused her of theft and had her fired. But that wasn't enough. Margaret made sure Claire couldn't find work anywhere else. She was desperate, with a child to care for. And then she trailed off, her gaze shifting to the shadows. And then what? Lucy asked urgently. She didn't make it out, the woman said, her voice heavy with regret. The night she left, there was an accident. A car crash. But I don't believe it was an accident at all. Lucy's blood ran cold. You think Margaret? I don't think, child. I know. Before Lucy could ask more, the sound of footsteps startled them both. The woman stepped back, melting into the shadows of the trees. Wait! Lucy called, but the woman was gone. Instead, Margaret emerged from the house, her face a mask of fury. What do you think you're doing out here? Margaret demanded, grabbing Lucy's arm. I couldn't sleep, Lucy stammered. Margaret's grip tightened. You're lying. You've been sneaking around again, haven't you? Lucy tried to pull away, but Margaret's hold was like iron. You think you're clever, Margaret hissed. But you have no idea who you're dealing with. If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll make sure you never set foot outside again. Lucy's chest tightened with fear, but she refused to let Margaret see her weakness. You're scared, she said, her voice trembling. You're scared because you know I'll find out what you did to my mother. Margaret's face twisted with rage. Your mother was nothing, and you're just as pathetic as she was. Mark my words, little girl, you won't win. She released Lucy with a shove, sending her stumbling back. Get inside, Margaret ordered, her voice cold and commanding. Lucy returned to her room, her mind racing. The woman's words had confirmed what she'd suspected all along. Margaret was responsible for her mother's death. But how could she prove it? The answer lay somewhere in the house. She was sure of it. But finding it would mean risking everything. As Lucy stared out the window at the now empty garden, a single thought kept her awake. Margaret might have destroyed her mother, but she wouldn't let her destroy her, too. The following morning dawned gray and ominous, the air heavy with tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the Walden estate. Lucy sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her mother's letter and the small brass key that had unlocked so many secrets. She knew the stakes now. Margaret had destroyed her mother, and she wouldn't hesitate to do the same to her. But Lucy wasn't going to let that happen. She had to act quickly, before Margaret carried out her threats. Downstairs, the mood was strained. Richard sat in the dining room, his face etched with worry. Margaret flitted about, her cheerful facade firmly in place, but her sharp glances toward Lucy betrayed her true feelings. I've made arrangements, Margaret said breezily, setting down her coffee cup. Lucy will be leaving tomorrow morning. The institution has space for her, and I think we'll all breathe a little easier once this nonsense is behind us. Lucy froze. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. You don't have a choice, dear. Richard slammed his hand on the table, startling everyone. Enough, Margaret. We are not sending Lucy away. She's disrupting this household, Richard, Margaret snapped, dropping her pretense. She's digging into things that are better left alone. That's because you've been lying to us, Richard countered. He turned to Lucy, his voice softening. What else did you find? Lucy hesitated, glancing at Margaret's furious expression. But she met Richard's gaze and said, I found another letter. My mother tried to warn you about Margaret. She said Margaret would do anything to keep her secrets. Richard's face darkened, and he turned back to his wife. What is she talking about, Margaret? Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. You're seriously taking her word over mine? She's a child, Richard, a manipulative little girl who has no business being here. She's telling the truth, Richard said firmly. And I want to hear it from you. What did you do to Claire? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Margaret's mask of composure cracked, and her voice dropped to a low, venomous tone. Fine. You want the truth? Claire was a problem from the moment she set foot in this house. She thought she was better than me, always acting so righteous. And then she went and had that child. Margaret's eyes darted to Lucy, filled with disdain. Everything changed after that, Margaret continued. She thought she deserved more, that she could just leave and take whatever she wanted with her. So yes, I had her fired. And when she tried to defy me, I made sure she couldn't. You caused the accident, didn't you? Lucy asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Margaret laughed coldly. You think I ran her off the road myself? No, dear. I didn't have to. I just made her desperate enough to run. She was reckless, and she paid the price for it. Richard rose from his chair, his face pale with fury. You destroyed her. And you've been lying about it ever since. Don't you dare blame me for her choices. Margaret shot back. She was weak. And now you're letting her daughter ruin everything we've built. This isn't about what we've built, Richard said. This is about what you've done. You've hurt people, Margaret. And I won't let you hurt Lucy. Margaret's composure shattered completely. She lunged at Lucy, her voice a shriek. You think you've won, you little brat? You think he'll protect you? Richard stepped between them, his voice thundering. Get out of this house, Margaret. Margaret froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. You can't be serious. I've had enough, Richard said, his voice steady. You've lied, manipulated, and destroyed lives. I should have stopped you a long time ago. Pack your things and leave. Now. Margaret's expression twisted with rage and despair. You'll regret this, Richard. You'll see. She's nothing but trouble. Richard didn't respond, and Margaret stormed out of the room. The aftermath of the confrontation left Lucy feeling a mixture of relief and unease. Margaret was gone, but the weight of her mother's tragedy still hung heavily over her. She sat with Richard in the study that evening, the two of them going through her mother's letters and photographs together. I should have seen it, Richard said quietly, his voice thick with regret. Claire trusted me, and I failed her. Lucy placed a hand on his arm, her own grief mirrored in his eyes. You didn't know. But you can make it right now. Richard nodded, determination hardening his features. We'll make it right together, Lucy. You're not alone anymore. That night, Lucy stood by her bedroom window, staring out at the garden bathed in moonlight. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her mother's fight hadn't been in vain. The truth had come to light, and Margaret's reign of cruelty was over. But as Lucy's gaze drifted to the shadows near the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sunlight cutting through the tension that had long enveloped the Walden estate. For the first time since Lucy had arrived, the house felt lighter, almost peaceful. Margaret was gone. The confrontation the day before had marked the end of her cruel control over the household, and Lucy allowed herself a moment of cautious relief. But as she looked around the sprawling property from her bedroom window, she knew her journey wasn't over. Her mother's memory deserved more than a fleeting victory. It deserved closure. Lucy found Richard in the study later that morning, sorting through piles of paperwork with Evelyn's help. The two worked in silence, their expressions somber but focused. I want to help, Lucy said, stepping into the room. Richard looked up, his tired eyes softening. You've already done so much, Lucy. You've been braver than anyone I know. But it's not enough, Lucy insisted. I need to know everything. I need to understand what really happened to my mother. Richard exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who nodded slightly. She deserves to know, sir, Evelyn said quietly. Richard sighed and gestured for Lucy to sit. All right. Let's go through this together. They spent hours piecing together the fragments of Claire Bennett's story. The letters, photographs, and journal entries painted a vivid picture of a woman who had been strong, compassionate, and deeply devoted to her daughter. She worked so hard to give you a better life, Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. She wanted to leave the estate, to start fresh somewhere else. But Margaret. Margaret saw that as a betrayal. Evelyn added, Margaret couldn't stand the idea of losing control. She used every tool she had, lies, accusations, threats, to keep Claire here. And the accident? Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening. I can't prove Margaret orchestrated it. But the timing, the circumstances, it's hard to believe it was just a coincidence. Lucy's heart ached with the weight of their words. Her mother had fought so hard, only to be cut down before she could escape. That afternoon, Lucy ventured into the garden, the place her mother had once loved. She carried her mother's journal with her, its worn pages a testament to Claire's strength and resilience. She found a quiet spot beneath a tall oak tree and sat there, the breeze rustling the leaves above. As she read the final entries of the journal, tears streamed down her face. Lucy, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay with you. But know that I loved you more than anything in this world. You are my light, my hope, my everything. Be brave, my darling. Be stronger than I ever was. Lucy closed the journal, clutching it to her chest. I'll make you proud, Mom, she whispered. Richard joined her in the garden a short while later, carrying a small wooden box. I thought you might want this, he said, sitting beside her. Inside the box were more photographs, letters, and a delicate silver locket. Lucy opened the locket to find a tiny picture of herself as a baby on one side and her mother on the other. It was hers, Richard said softly. She wanted you to have it one day. Lucy slipped the locket around her neck, the weight of it comforting against her heart. The days that followed were filled with quiet rebuilding. Margaret's departure left a void, but it was one that Richard, Evelyn, and Lucy worked together to fill. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a battleground and more like a home. Evelyn, always a steady presence, became a surrogate grandmother to Lucy, offering wisdom and warmth. Richard, determined to honor Claire's memory, devoted himself to creating a stable and loving environment for Lucy. And Lucy, though still carrying the scars of her past, began to find strength in her mother's legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard called Lucy to the study. I've been thinking about the future, he said, his tone serious but kind. You've been through so much, and I want you to know that you'll always have a place here. This is your home now, Lucy. If you'll have it. Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. For so long, she had felt like an outsider, unwanted and unloved. But now, she finally felt like she belonged. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. I want to stay. Richard smiled, his own eyes glistening. Then it settled. That night, as Lucy lay in bed, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The shadows of her past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer held the same power over her. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, Be brave, my darling. Be stronger than I ever was. And for the first time, Lucy believed she could be. Outside her window, the garden shimmered in the moonlight, a quiet reminder of the love and resilience that had brought her this far. She closed her eyes, the locket warm against her chest, and allowed herself to dream of a brighter future.